On the morning of December 16, 1977, a gray Ford had been parked motionless for hours in the parking lot of the Quality Inn Hotel in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. An employee conducting a routine check noticed the vehicle. When he looked inside, he discovered the lifeless body of a young woman in the back seat, naked, bound, mutilated. The police were called immediately. The scene that greeted investigators was gruesome. The woman, later identified as 26-year-old Marion Carr, had deep cuts on her chest and legs. Her wrists and ankles were covered in welts from restraints. Her mouth was covered with tape, and there were bite marks on several parts of her body. The last trace of her led to a parking lot in Little Ferry, where she had been seen the night before. That was where she lived, in the same apartment complex where a certain Richard Cottingham had once lived with his family. At that point, Cottingham was a blank slate for investigators. No one suspected that the murder of Marion Carr was not the work of a single perpetrator, but rather part of a series of unsolved violent crimes. The Carr case joined the growing list of brutal, unsolved murders of women in the New York metropolitan area. The victims often came from marginalized groups, women who worked in clubs, escorts, runaways, women whose disappearances were rarely reported, women who were often alone. Cottingham knew these weaknesses. He was not an impulsive perpetrator, but a hunter. His methods varied from case to case, sometimes drugs, sometimes bondage, sometimes fire. But the goal was always the same: total control. No one suspected him of these crimes. He was 31 years old, married, had 3 children, and worked in an open-plan office for a health insurance company. His demeanor? Unremarkable. His environment? Average. His facade? Perfect. But on the night of December 15th to 16, that facade faltered for a moment, and that was only the beginning. The man who took Marion Carr's life on December 16, 1977, was outwardly the exact opposite of a serial killer. Richard Francis Cottingham, born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, New York, grew up in a seemingly stable family. His father was an insurance clerk, his mother a housewife. As the eldest of 3 children, Richard was brought up with discipline, order, a sense of duty, good grades. Nothing in his childhood indicated what was to come decades later, but Richard was a quiet, withdrawn boy. He developed a fascination for power and control at an early age, which initially manifested itself harmlessly in stories, comics, and later in erotic magazines. As he entered adolescence, he became increasingly interested in sadistic content. He didn't talk to anyone about it, and that's exactly what made him dangerous. After graduating from high school in 1964, Cottingham joined the same insurance company where his father worked. He soon moved to the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association, where he was considered a hard-working clerk in the years that followed. He was punctual, friendly, and reliable. In May 1970, he married Jeanette Winsky, and the couple had 3 children. The family moved to New Jersey. With a house, a car, and a career, on paper he was a man many would envy. But while he filled out forms during the day and played with his children in the evening, another urge grew inside him: a hunger for control, for submission, for violence. The first known murder took place in 1967. Nancy Foggy, 29, married and mother of 2, disappeared on her way to church. Hours later, she was found naked, bound, and dead in her car. Traces of sexual violence, strangulation marks, but no usable clues as to the perpetrator. The case was never solved. Years later, it emerged that Cottingham had known her personally. He knew exactly when and where she was going. 2 years later, in 1969, Cottingham was arrested for the first time for drunk driving. The sentence: 10 days in jail and a $50 fine. No one raised the alarm. No one connected him to previous incidents. In 1972, he came to the attention of the authorities again. He was caught shoplifting in a department store and reported for a violent assault on a woman. But there were no witnesses, no evidence. The charges were dropped. His wife had no idea. And if she suspected anything, she didn't say anything. Cottingham spent more and more time at work, working overtime, going to bed late, staying out late. The reality was different. He roamed the streets of Manhattan, frequented bars, looking for women who weren't missed by anyone. What made him so dangerous was his ability to adapt. He could disguise himself, appear charming and harmless, but as soon as the door of a hotel room closed behind him, the mask disappeared, and the monster emerged. In May 1980, just under 2.5 years after the murder of Marion Carr, 18-year-old Leslie N. Odell arrived in New York. She had run away from home, from the confines, from her problems. Like many young women who came to this city hoping to build a better life, she ended up on the streets, penniless and without a plan. She quickly fell into the hands of pimps who were specifically looking for fresh meat. Leslie agreed to sleep with strangers for money. She had no choice. On May 22nd, just 4 days after her arrival, Leslie was standing on Lexington Avenue when a man approached her. He was well-groomed, friendly, and had a calm voice. He seemed educated, honest, almost empathetic. Leslie was often cautious and suspicious, but he seemed different. He asked if she wanted to have a drink. She agreed. In the bar, they talked about their lives. She told him about her violent pimp and how she wanted to escape. The man offered to drive her to the bus station in New Jersey. From there, she could travel on, perhaps back home. Leslie hesitated, but the thought of a new beginning was tempting. But instead of taking her to the bus station, he took her to a hotel in South Hackensack, New Jersey, the Quality Inn. He checked in, paid in cash, and used a pseudonym. They went to the room together. Around 5 a.m., he suggested giving her a massage. Leslie lay down on her stomach. The moment she relaxed, the friendly man turned into a brutal attacker. He took a knife out of a briefcase, pressed it against her throat, handcuffed her, and began to systematically torture her. He bit her on the chest, made small cuts on her back with the knife, and beat her with a leather belt. "You're a parasite," he said, "and you're going to pay for what you do." Leslie screamed, and that's exactly what saved her life. Just 18 days earlier, a woman had been murdered in that hotel. The staff was on high alert. When there was a knock at the door, the perpetrator forced Leslie to open it. At gunpoint and threatening to shoot her if she made a sound or tried to escape, she knew that any wrong move could be her last. But she managed to signal to the employee with a barely perceptible glance that she was in danger. The employee reacted immediately and alerted the police. When the officers stormed the room, the perpetrator was no longer there, but he didn't get far. Just a few minutes later, he was arrested in the hallway with a briefcase containing handcuffs, a leather gag, 2 collars, a knife, a gun, and several sedatives. His name, Richard Cottingham. At first he claimed that Leslie had been with him voluntarily. She was a prostitute, he said, and it had been consensual. But Leslie contradicted him. In her statement, she described every minute of the horror with shocking detail and mentioned a sentence that caught the investigators' attention. He had forced her to take pills. Like the others. The others. With those 2 words, she opened the door to a past full of violence and death. And she gave investigators the crucial clue they needed to link Cottingham to a whole series of unsolved murders. After Richard Cottingham's arrest and Leslie Odell's statement, the investigators began a race against time. They now knew that this man was not a random perpetrator. He was prepared, structured, and probably a repeat offender. The reference to the other women led investigators to search specifically for similar cases, and they found what they were looking for faster than expected. Just 2 weeks before the attack on Leslie on May 5, 1980, the body of a young woman had been discovered in the same Quality Inn in South Hackensack. She was handcuffed, her mouth taped shut, her body covered in bite marks and bruises. The woman's name was Valerie Ann Street, 19 years old, originally from Florida, who had only recently come to New York to work as an escort. The perpetrator had introduced himself as John. After that, he disappeared without a trace. But this time, he had made a mistake. During the forensic examination of Valerie's body, the handcuffs were carefully examined, and a partial thumbprint was found on one of the shackles. At the time, investigators had no reference sample. But now, with Cottingham in custody, the comparison revealed a clear match. The man who had killed Valerie was the same man who had tortured Leslie. The connection was there, and it was stronger than any suspicion. The investigators now began to piece together Cottingham's past, hotels where he had stayed, names under which he had booked rooms, phone numbers, credit cards, working hours. A pattern emerged, one that had been so well hidden that it could only be seen as obvious in hindsight. He had regularly booked hotel rooms under false names such as Carl Wilson or Jim Schaefer, always near bus stations or red light districts, always alone, and always for just one night. His bookings were compared with unsolved deaths. One case from December 1979 was particularly striking. At that time, 2 charred, decapitated female corpses had been found at the Travel Inn in New York, in room 417, which had been booked a few days earlier under the name Carl Wilson. The victims had no fingerprints left. Their faces had been made unrecognizable, their bodies had been tied up, their clothes neatly folded in the bathroom. The perpetrator had brutally tortured them, severed their heads and hands, and set the room on fire. Nothing was more important to him than ensuring they could not be identified. Now, with Cottingham's handwriting known, it was clear that this was also his work. He had proceeded methodically. He was thoughtful, disciplined, and at the same time cruel to the point of perversion. With each additional piece of evidence, each secured clue, it became clear to investigators that Richard Cottingham was not just a violent criminal. He was a strategic serial killer who had been killing women for years without being detected, and covering his tracks like a pro. The prosecution obtained a search warrant for Cottingham's home in Lodi, New Jersey, where he had lived with his family. What investigators found there was definitive proof that these were not isolated incidents. In the basement of the house, they came across a hidden chamber behind what appeared to be a solid shelf. Inside this chamber was a kind of trophy collection, neatly stored, as if in an archive. It contained women's underwear, makeup bags, hair accessories, notebooks, photos, jewelry, and a pair of high heels that were later identified as belonging to one of the unknown victims. To an outsider, it was a chaotic collection of random items. To Cottingham, it was an altar, a collection of moments of power, memories of submission, control, dominance. Each piece carried a story, a cry that no one could hear anymore. At the same time, investigators found a list of names, phone numbers, and room numbers in an old briefcase, seemingly harmless. But when checked against police records, several of these women appeared in missing persons reports. Some of them had been found dead. Some had never been identified. Some had never been reported missing. Cottingham himself denied everything. He claimed that the items belonged to former partners, that they were old mementos he had kept out of courtesy. The fingerprints on the handcuffs, a mistake. Leslie's statements, lies. The bite marks, coincidence. The basement room, a private storage room. His calmness was almost frightening. He spoke clearly, matter-of-factly, without remorse. He emphasized again and again, "I am not a murderer. I am a victim." But the evidence against him grew. The prosecution soon filed official charges of multiple murder. Initially, he was charged with 3 murders: Valerie Ann Street, one of the decapitated women from the Travel Inn, and Marianne Carr, whose body had been found on December 16, 1977. Attempted murders and rapes were added to the charges, including in the cases of Leslie Odell and Pamela Weisenfeld. When Cottingham's ex-wife learned of the allegations, she collapsed. She had suspected that her husband had a dark side, but not to this extent. He often worked overtime and didn't come home for days. She thought he was having an affair, not murder. The police now spoke publicly of a serial killer, possibly with more than a dozen victims, and at the center of the investigation was a man whom no one had even suspected for years. The trial against Richard Cottingham began in 1982. The charges were extensive: murder, attempted murder, rape, kidnapping, and assault. There were 6 specific crimes, but investigators had long suspected that the number of victims was much higher. Cottingham appeared calm, composed, almost arrogant in the courtroom. He was convinced that nothing could be proven against him, but on the very first day of the trial, it became clear that the evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints on the handcuffs, matching DNA traces, witness statements from surviving women, trophies from his secret basement, handwritten notes that matched hotel bookings. But what made the trial so special was not only the evidence, but Cottingham's own statements. In a surprising turn of events, he confessed in court that he had been fascinated by the idea of total submission since his youth. As a teenager, he read pornographic magazines with sadistic content and was interested in stories about domination and bondage. "I wanted control," he said, "and I got it." He spoke about his actions not as crimes, but as personal achievements. These statements shocked not only the audience in the courtroom, but also experienced investigators. Cottingham showed no remorse, no compassion, no guilt. He was completely detached from human reality. A man who had learned to simulate emotions and at the same time to extinguish the lives of others without batting an eyelid. After several weeks of trial, the court handed down its verdict, a total of more than 200 years in prison, with no prospect of early release. But the story did not end there. In the decades that followed while he was in prison, Cottingham repeatedly contacted journalists, authors, and investigators. He toyed with them as he had with his victims. He claimed to be responsible for over 100 murders. "There are many you don't know about," he once told a reporter, and indeed, in the years that followed, he confessed to several more crimes that had remained unsolved until then. Some of these statements led to new investigations. In several cases, archived evidence proved his guilt. This brought the number of his confirmed victims to at least 18. When Richard Cottingham, a man who checked bills during the day and took the lives of others at night, was arrested, investigators believed they had caught a brutal killer. What they actually discovered was a system that had failed for decades.